Welcome to the Quotive Corner. I want to do something a little different today, and I want to tell you why before we get into it. Every quote we've covered on this show so far has come from a real person, someone who actually lived, actually said or wrote the words, actually existed in history. Today, I'm departing from that. Today's quote is fictional. It comes from a movie, spoken by a character who doesn't exist, written by a screenwriter putting words into that character's mouth. And I want to be upfront about that distinction, because it matters. But here's the thing. It doesn't matter as much as you'd think. We can be moved, changed, and genuinely affected by something even when we know it was invented. Fiction has been doing that to human beings for as long as we've been telling stories. So today, we're going to let it. I also want to mention something about how I pick these quotes generally, because it applies especially today. I try not to reach for the most famous line from the most famous book or film. Everyone already knows the obvious quote from the obvious source. I'd rather find something a little further off the beaten path, something that might be new to you, even if it comes from a well-known piece of work. That's the spirit of today's pick. Other animals live in the present. Humans cannot. So they invented hope. That's from I'm Thinking of Ending Things, the 2020 film written and directed by Charlie Kaufman, based on the novel by Iain Reid. The line is spoken by the central character, known simply as the young woman, played by Jessie Buckley. The fuller passage that surrounds it is worth hearing in full. Everything has to die. That's the truth. One likes to think that there is always hope, that you can live above death. And it's a uniquely human fantasy that things will get better, born perhaps of the uniquely human understanding that things will not. There's no way to know for certain, but I suspect humans are the only animals that know the inevitability of their own deaths. Other animals live in the present. Humans cannot, so they invented hope. That's a heavy passage. Let's look more into this carefully, because there's real insight buried in the bleakness. The claim being made is this. Hope is not a virtue handed down from somewhere transcendent. It's a tool, a coping mechanism, something humans built, consciously or not, specifically because we are the one species burdened with the knowledge that everything ends. Animals, as far as we can tell, do not carry that knowledge forward. A deer grazing in a field is not contemplating its own mortality. It exists in the present moment because the present moment is all there is for a creature without the cognitive architecture to project forward into an ending it can foresee but not control. Humans are different. We are, as far as we know, the only species capable of understanding with certainty that we will die, and capable of knowing that understanding well in advance of the event itself, sometimes for decades. That is an enormous psychological weight to carry, and the character in this film is proposing that hope is the mechanism we invented to carry it, not because hope is necessarily true, or because the future actually will be better, but because the alternative, sitting permanently and consciously inside the knowledge of inevitable ending, would be unbearable without something to soften it. That's a genuinely unsettling idea, and the film doesn't deliver it gently. But before we either reject it or sink into it, let's actually examine what it's claiming and where it might be incomplete. The first thing worth noticing is that the claim conflates two different things, whether hope is invented and whether hope is therefore false or worthless. Those are separate questions, and the quote only really answers the first one. Yes, in some meaningful sense, hope probably is a construction of the human mind, a way of organizing our relationship to an uncertain and mortal future. But plenty of things that are constructions are also genuinely valuable and genuinely true in the ways that matter most. Language is invented. Mathematics, in some philosophical sense, is invented. Justice, as a concept, is invented. None of that makes any of them illusions to be dismissed. The fact that humans created something to address a real problem doesn't mean that something is fake. It might mean it's remarkably well adapted to the problem it was built for. Consider what hope actually does, mechanically, in a human life. It is not primarily a claim about the future being knowable or guaranteed. It's an orientation, a way of facing forward into uncertainty that allows continued engagement with life rather than paralysis or despair. The person recovering from illness who hopes for improvement isn't necessarily certain of the outcome. They are choosing an orientation that makes continued effort, continued treatment, continued living possible. Remove the hope and you don't necessarily get clearer thinking. You often just get collapse. Viktor Frankl, writing from inside Auschwitz, observed something directly relevant here. He noticed that prisoners who lost all sense of a future, who could no longer imagine anything beyond the present suffering, tended to deteriorate rapidly, sometimes fatally, even when their physical circumstances hadn't changed. The ones who survived longer, psychologically and often physically, were frequently the ones who held on to some orientation toward a future moment, however uncertain. Hope, in that context, wasn't a delusion that obscured reality. It was something closer to a survival mechanism that allowed reality to remain bearable enough to keep functioning inside it. So perhaps the film's character is half right. Hope probably is something humans generated in response to a knowledge no other creature has to carry. But the word invented doesn't have to land as an accusation. It can land as a description of one of the more remarkable adaptive achievements our species has managed, the ability to know our own ending and still somehow build lives, relationships, and meaning in the time before it arrives. The character's bleakness is real and worth taking seriously rather than dismissing. There is something genuinely strange about being the only species, as far as we can tell, that carries this particular knowledge forward. And there are days when that knowledge presses harder than others, when the awareness of finitude feels less like background noise and more like the loudest thing in the room. The film is not wrong that this is a real and specific human burden. But carrying a burden and being defeated by it are not the same thing. The animals in the field don't need hope because they don't carry the knowledge that demands it. Humans do need it. And so we built it. That's not evidence of human delusion. It might be evidence of human resourcefulness in the face of the one fact none of us can change. Hope, examined honestly, isn't a denial of death. It's a response to it. And a remarkably effective one for a species that has somehow managed to keep building, creating, loving, and trying in full knowledge of how the story ends. Maybe that's not a coping mechanism to be ashamed of. Maybe that's one of the more dignified things about being human at all. Thanks for spending a few minutes here at the Quotive Corner. If today's departure from the usual format gave you something to think about, fictional or not, that's exactly the point of doing it. And as always, consider that wisdom isn't in the quote, it's in the reflection. I'll see you soon in the next episode.